Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Eller Economic Outlook, this year sponsored by JP Morgan Chase. My name is George Hammond. I'm Director of the Economic and Business Research Center in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. We have a great program for you this morning. We'll begin with opening remarks by Edmundo Gamillo of JP Morgan Chase and Dean Paulo Goes of the Eller College of Management. Then we'll turn the webinar over to Jennifer Pullen, Senior Research Economist in the Economic and Business Research Center, and she will moderate discussions with Anthony Chan, former Chief Economist at Chase, and also with me. And before we do that, I want to bring to your attention the Q&A button on your Zoom controls. Using the Q&A button, you can send questions for Anthony and I. If time permits, we'll address those live during the webinar. If not, we will address them at some point on our Arizona's Economy online magazine. Either way, we really want to hear from you about the topics and issues that you would like to see the Economic and Business Research Center address as we go through 2021. So be sure and submit a question, give us a suggestion for further research topics, and we'll put those into our planning for 2021. Now on our Arizona's Economy online magazine at azeconomy.org, you will find supporting materials for my presentation, both PDF slides that you would normally see in a presentation and also written analysis of the Outlook. So be sure and visit azeconomy.org for that information. Well, at this point, it's my pleasure to invite Edmundo Gamillo of JP Morgan Chase to start his video and unmute and give his opening remarks. Please go ahead, Edmundo.
Thank you, George, and good morning, everyone. I am Edmundo Gamillo, and I am an Executive Director for Chase Commercial Banking in Southern Arizona. On behalf of my Arizona colleagues at JP Morgan Chase, it is a privilege to welcome you to the 2020 Eller College Annual Economic Outlook. After a challenging year, JP Morgan Chase is proud to return as sponsor for today's event. Creating a strong economic recovery is a challenge that we have taken on at JP Morgan Chase with numerous initiatives at the global, national, and local levels. We understand that many have been affected by this crisis, from our colleagues, families, and communities to our customers, clients, and partners. It is important we work together across businesses, governments, and communities to assist those who need help the most. Earlier this year, JP Morgan Chase announced a $50 million philanthropic investment to address the immediate public health and long-term economic challenges from the COVID-19 economic pandemic. These funds are addressing both humanitarian and economic challenges, supporting vulnerable and unrepresented communities, small businesses, and existing non-for-profits. Long-term, we are focused on working with existing partners and leaning into our areas of expertise, including financial health, jobs and skills, small business growth, and neighborhood development, and apply lessons learned from our philanthropic initiatives. Of this fund, $35 million will be deployed over time to help the most vulnerable communities and people recover from the crisis. And we have an opportunity to benefit from future economic growth. As one of Arizona's leading financial institutions for more than 100 years, we also have our eyes on the local needs of Southern Arizona. We are deeply rooted in this community, and we want to make a difference. Locally, we are working with numerous non-for-profit partners to help address the issues of workforce readiness, small business development, community development, and affordable housing and financial capability. In Tucson, for example, we have continued our partnership with the Primavera Foundation, which provides pathways out of poverty by delivering one-on-one financial coaching and housing counseling integrated into its overall affordable housing programs. At the Eller College of Management, we also support a program to help underserved entrepreneurs achieve their financial goals. In 2019 alone, we made $3.6 million in charitable contributions to Arizona non-for-profits organizations. Therefore, as we look towards 2021, we remain deeply committed to our clients, many of whom are in this call. To our clients here today, I would like to say thank you. We are able to continue our investment in Southern Arizona only because you give us the opportunity to serve you. Thank you for being here today, and our best wishes to all of you. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Edmundo. I'd now like to call on Dean Paulo Goes to start his video and unmute and give a welcome on behalf of the University of Arizona.
Thank you, George. And thank you, JP Morgan and Edmundo Gamillo for your continuous support. Hi, everyone. I am Paulo Goes. I'm the Dean of the Eller College of Management. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. Usually, as you know, we would be at the Westin La Paloma, and I look forward to being there a year from now. In the meantime, thank you for joining this Zoom webinar. I am proud to share again with you this year the outstanding work of the Economics and Business Research Center. Throughout the year, EBRC and George Hammond's team do outstanding research related to business trends, forecasts, the trade, the economy, the border, and much more, with the intent of sharing and informing our communities. They have been particularly busy in this unusual year. I always like to use this opportunity to remind you of all the outstanding programs and initiatives we have going in the Eller College of Management. We are a top business and economics school right here, right in your backyard, Tucson and Arizona attendees. From allowing you to hire our top talent, to structure internships, or to further your education and enhancing your workforce, we are here for you. So please connect with us if you're interested in taking yourself or your organization to the next level through leadership programs or advanced degrees. We have both great campus programs and online programs. We were ranked recently a top 10 program by US News and World Report among all the online MBA programs in the country. And our executive education program is currently #1 in Arizona. So now it's my pleasure to turn the Zoom mic over to Jennifer Pullen. Jennifer is a senior research economist and map dashboard coordinator in Eller's Economic and Business Research Center. She holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of Arizona. She's also a longtime Tucson resident who now telecommutes to work at the U of A from South Carolina. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Paulo. It's great to be here with everyone today. I would like to welcome and introduce Anthony Chan. He's our first speaker. He's former chief economist at Chase and frequent participant at this event. Dr. Chan is known worldwide for his insightful analysis and excellent presentations. His analysis appear frequently in media outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNBC, CNN, Fox, and many others. Dr. Chan is a member of many forecasting panels, including the prestigious Blue Chip Monthly Forecasting Panel. Welcome, Anthony. I hope you're doing well. Can you please unmute and start your video at this time? Once Anthony gets started. Yeah. Hi, Anthony.
Hi.
Good to see you. Let's get started. Our first question today is going to be, what theme would best describe what happened to the U.S. economy in 2020 and what is in store for the U.S. economy in 2021?
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for having me. Certainly, 2020 was the year in which we had this terrible pandemic. And of course, we had quite a bit of stimulus. But like you and all of us, we're all trying to do our best in these circumstances. In fact, I was impressed the other day when the president-elect was asked how he was doing. He said he's going to try to put his best foot forward. And so when you hear that, you have to be very impressed that we're all doing our best to do whatever we can to survive this pandemic. The year 2020 was challenging. You saw that in the real GDP numbers slipping in the first half of the year, simply because we closed down the overall economy. But it could have been worse. And the reason why it wasn't worse is because we had huge amounts of stimulus put into the overall economy. And despite the fact that we had so many people losing their jobs because of the health crisis, we saw that disposable income was still positive by the third quarter on a year-to-date basis. And that's because of all the help that the federal government and of course the Federal Reserve put into the overall economy. Given that as a backdrop, I am optimistic about 2021 because I think in 2021 we have more good news. And the good news, of course, is in the form of not only the fruits of all this stimulus that we've received, but we also have a vaccine that's coming around the corner. What I see now is that by June of 2021, we should see about 150 million people being vaccinated. We know that, in fact, 13.5 million people, sadly, many of us know that we've had COVID-19 impact our families, our friends, our dear loved ones. So we've seen that 13.5 million people have survived the virus. And the hope and expectation is that these individuals will somehow not get the pandemic a second time, even though there's a small share that are in fact getting it. By the middle of 2021, we'll have that number be as large as 30 million people. So when you take that 150 million, and I'm assuming that even in the month of December of 2020, that we may not even get any vaccines. We will get some, but I'm trying to be as conservative as possible. So by June of 2021, we'll have more than 50% of the people out there having some form of immunity and approaching herd immunity. That means that economic growth will continue to improve as we go into 2021, even though the next 3 to 4 months will be very challenging for the US economy. So the bottom line, Jennifer, is that we've gone through a lot, but the light is at the end of the tunnel, and economic growth, not only in the United States, but really around the world, is going to improve as we go into 2021, but it will be a challenge.
Thank you. So this year we saw a total collapse in the US economy during the coronavirus pandemic, as you mentioned, and that was more severe than anything we observed during the global financial crisis. Yet our economy managed to recover much faster. Can you speak to why that happened?
I think the reason why the economy, Jennifer, recovered so quickly was simply because this was not a typical economic crisis. The global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, that was an economic crisis. And we obviously lost over 8 million jobs. And then it took a long time to recover. One, this time we had stimulus coming a lot quicker from both the Federal Reserve and the federal government, but it was also somewhat controlled because we closed and reopened the economy. We lost more jobs, 22 million jobs. But as a result of the fact that it was somewhat controlled, it was not a pure economic crisis, it was more a health crisis, we were able to recover a lot quicker. And I think that that is very positive, and it speaks to the fact that when you don't have an economic crisis, things can turn a lot quicker. But moving forward, we still need to understand that the health crisis caused severe pain, and that it's not going to go away very quickly. In January, we get the vaccine, but we all know that it's not going to be like flipping the switch. We know that in January, we still have to deal with the fact that there are 21 million people that are in the healthcare profession that need to get those vaccines. We know there are 53 million people over the age of 65 that need to get that vaccine. And we know there are another 87 million essential workers. So to assume that very quickly we'll go back to normal, I think it is a huge mistake right now. But again, why do we recover so much quicker? Because it was controlled to some extent by policymakers, because it wasn't a pure economic crisis. It was more a health crisis.
Well, we saw that in 2020, the technology sector was a clear outperformer. What sectors do you expect will have that distinction in 2021?
Well, as you go into 2021, we have to ask ourselves, what is likely to happen? Well, first of all, inflation is going to start to pick up a little bit more. And historically, when inflation picks up a little bit more, you tend to see that the value sectors do a lot better than the growth sectors. And technology, of course, is a growth sector. And so inflation is going to pick up from the 1.2% that we have right now for the consumer price index, probably approaching 2%. And you might say, well, where do you get these numbers from? Well, first of all, the money supply, when you look at M2, it is now growing at 24% on a year-over-year basis. Now, I'm not a monetarist. I'm not a Keynesian. I don't believe in necessarily rational expectation. I feel that I'm more of an eclectic, that I take ideas from all those schools of thought. And so you don't have to be a monetarist or a Keynesian to figure out that if the money supply is growing by 24%, that at some point you're going to have inflation. Now, the monetarist would tell you that the money supply has to grow by the nominal GDP growth rate and adjust for productivity. Now, productivity was up close to 4% in the third quarter. And of course, nominal GDP was down a little over 2%. So after adjusting for all that, clearly 24% is too much. Even if I adjust for all those things and I multiply that number by 10%, I still can't justify having the money supply growing at this pace. So inflation will pick up a little bit more. That gives opportunities for other sectors. Interest rates will rise a little bit more. And that means that the banking or the financial sector will do a little bit better because they've been suffering from a flat yield curve. And it's been a real challenging time for the banks to make money. But as interest rates start to pick up from higher inflation, the financial sector will do a little bit better. The value sector, it's not that it's going to do extraordinarily better because inflation will pick up, but it'll pick up quite gradually. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the value sector, even though I think technology, there's still going to be a little room, but I think the easy money has been made in the technology sector. And then I also look for a lot of those companies and a lot of those sectors that have helped us adjust in this new world. That as we digitalize and we've now learned to buy things through the digital world. Just the other day, I got my credit card statement from Chase. I'm very loyal. I'm looking at those expenses, and I've learned, everybody in my family has learned how to spend more, even while we're locked up. And I basically told Chase to look at my statement one more time and do a recount because the balance was so high. Of course, they were gracious. That's why I'm so loyal. And they came back a few days later and they told me that the actual number was even larger because some other charges came in. So I'm not going to ask for any more recounts for a long time. But still, we're all adjusting in this new environment.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about the U.S. financial markets. The Federal Reserve credit facilities are scheduled to be reduced at the end of this year. Will that have any implication for U.S. financial markets? And if so, can the Federal Reserve offset such actions?
Good question, Jennifer. We know that recently the credit facilities that were going to add quite a bit to the financial sector and the credit market sector, they're going to be winding down by the end of the year. The good news is that there is at least some individuals out there that feel that when you get the president-elect coming back, that somehow we can restart those credit facilities again. Now, the argument was, Jennifer, that somehow because not a lot of credit was taken out with these credit facilities, that we could somehow make them go away and it wouldn't hurt us at all. But again, we remember from past administration, Republican administration, to be exact, Hank Paulson told us that when the Federal Reserve carries a big bazooka, they don't necessarily have to use it. And so that, I think, is why we didn't use those facilities. And now if we shut them down and we don't have the big bazooka, it could cause some nervousness in the financial markets. That's the bad news. The good news is that if the person appointed to Treasury, namely Janet Yellen, is approved in the Senate, and I have no reason to believe she won't, I think it'll open up the door for greater cooperation between the Federal Reserve and Treasury, sort of reminiscent of what we saw in the 1950s when we had the Treasury Accord and the Federal Reserve and Treasury were working together. So I am very confident that the fallout or any negative implication from the shutdown of these credit facilities will be offset by their activity. Let's not lose sight of the fact, Jennifer, that there's still in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, $70 billion plus worth of firepower that the Federal Reserve can access. So I'm pretty confident that the Federal Reserve will be able to offset this. And as for those that say, well, let's take that money and spend it to help out the economy, I say, sure, but that money really wasn't geared for spending. That was basically to serve as a backstop. And that's one of the reasons why the Congressional Budget Office didn't score this as an expenditure. They basically said whatever money you would make on these credit facilities would offset any losses. So it's not really an expenditure that you can take from one bucket and put it in the other. But right now, I'm pretty confident that as we look into 2021, that the Federal Reserve will be able to offset any negative implications. Finally, Jennifer, let's not lose sight of the fact that right now the Federal Reserve is purchasing approximately $120 billion worth of securities, treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and things like that every single month. And that, I think, is certainly explains to many people why the Federal Reserve has played a much larger role than it has in the past and will continue to play an even larger role moving forward to ensure that somehow that bridge between the time that the vaccine is introduced between now and then is as smooth as possible.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about housing a little bit. We've seen some good home price increases in Tucson and Arizona over the past year. Overall, the U.S. housing sector has been a pleasant catalyst for growth during the second half of 2020. Do you expect this trend to continue into 2021?
Jennifer, I really am continuing to be optimistic about the housing market. I think that we are seeing a lot of trends, especially in major cities where people are now adjusting to the fact that we may see more people working at home. In fact, a recent survey from CFOs found that they expect that a greater percentage of their workforce will be working from home. And as you have that, you're going to need more space. There's a greater demand for housing, and not to mention the fact that interest rates remain at very low levels. In fact, with inflation picking up, one possibility that the central bank has to make sure that this economic expansion continues is to think about what some economists call yield curve control. That means that they will try to suppress any increases in long-term interest rates, which will be very supportive for the housing market. So I think over the near term, yes, there's some negative headwinds, and those negative headwinds, as you mentioned, Jennifer, are the fact that housing prices are increasing. The latest numbers on the housing front suggested that the pending home sales data could have been stronger, but the fact that housing prices are rising very aggressively. But as we start to see more people gaining jobs, and we will see that, albeit it's going to be a gradual process, I continue to believe that housing will be a positive performer for the U.S. economy. The only bad news is that the housing sector is still less than 5% of the economy. And so even if housing is doing very well, it just can't carry the overall economy. We need the service sector, we need the hospitality sector, we need the airlines and those sectors to also pick up in order to see the U.S. economy. But for now, Jennifer, I'm cautiously optimistic that the housing sector should be able to continue moving forward.
Thank you. And as we look around the world, as you look around the world, which economies do you think adjusted best to a COVID-19 world, and which ones seem to fare worst? And then kind of as a follow-up to that is, what do you expect, which countries do you expect will outperform or underperform in 2021?
A great question, because that certainly has implications for the way we formulate our equity market portfolio. And what you see, Jennifer, is that some parts of the world did a lot better. There is debate now as to where this pandemic began. The early thoughts were that it began in Asia, namely China. And now, of course, some data is coming to light that suggests that that question is somewhat unclear. But irrespective of where the virus began, when I look around the world, I have to conclude that Asia did a lot better than the United States in managing the pandemic, by the way, and that explains why the equity market in China is doing so well. And it also explains, Jennifer, why China will be one of those few economies in the world that actually will register positive economic growth in 2020. They're going to grow by about 2% this year, as opposed to the United States will probably contract somewhere around 3.5%. So China was one of those really outperformers, but if you really want to see an economy that really flew with flying colors in terms of managing the virus, it has to be Taiwan. And I've been to China and Taiwan many, many times, but I have to say I was very impressed, not only with the few number of people that actually were impacted by the pandemic, but how little of a negative impact was in fact instilled in that economy because of the pandemic. So we see that Asia was certainly one of those economies. Now, not all of Asia, because if I look at one of the second largest economy in Asia, namely Japan or India, as I start to go down the line, you saw that in fact there was some negative fallout. In India, for example, we expect that India will contract this year by about 8.8%. The good news is that next year they'll rebound and probably grow at 11% or even a little bit better. Hong Kong was not only impacted by the pandemic, but obviously some of the protests, so they contract this year by about 5.7%, but even there, they're gonna rebound next year by 4.4%. Another economy that certainly stands out, Jennifer, in Asia is South Korea. South Korea will only contract this year by about 1.1%. That certainly makes other economies that had some negative fallout, they stand out compared. And then in 2021, South Korea will probably grow by over 3%. Now, let's look at other parts of the world, Jennifer, and that is Latin America. That was an economy that got hit pretty hard. Latin America as a whole will probably contract by 7% in 2020, but I look for a recovery, but it's not going to be an impressive recovery, maybe 2.5%, 2% growth next year. And of course, the economies that got hit the hardest in Latin America were Mexico and Argentina. Mexico probably contracting about 9%, Argentina by about 10.5%, and the recovery in Mexico probably somewhere around 3%, and maybe about 4% recovery in Argentina. And then as I look to Europe, I have to say that Europe did not get a good deal from this pandemic. The Euro area will contract this year by about 7.5%, which was a very steep decline, and they're going to grow by about 4% next year. Now that, by the way, Jennifer, introduces some opportunities for 2021 because the equity market doesn't look at where we've been, they look at where we're going. And so even if the contraction in growth in Europe was 7.5%, the fact that they're likely to grow by about 4% tells me that looking at equities in Europe for 2021, I think is an interesting place. Now, which countries got hit the hardest? Spain, of course, contracting by 11% this year. Next year, probably recovering by about 6%. Italy, contracting this year by 8.6%. And next year, probably growing by about 5.5%. So even France, contracting this year by about 9%, but next year, likely to pick up by 5.5%. The United Kingdom is not only suffering from the pandemic, but they also have to deal with Brexit. So they almost got a double whammy of negative headwinds. So I look for the United Kingdom to contract this year by about 11%. But the good news, Jennifer, is that next year, that economy shall rebound, assuming that they have a smooth Brexit rather than a hard one. Next year, I look for economic growth to grow in the UK by about 6%. So if you're willing to bet that they'll do the right thing and have a smooth Brexit, I think the United Kingdom is also an interesting place to invest in the equity market as we look to next year.
Let's go back to China for a moment and talk about trade tensions, U.S. trade tensions with China. Do you anticipate those to worsen or improve in 2021? And kind of along those lines, what are the implications for the U.S. growth, economic growth?
Well, Jennifer, I look for the trade tensions to actually improve as you go into 2021. And again, I'm the most nonpartisan economist you'll ever meet, so I don't take sides. But we look at President-elect's track record over the last 30 or 40 years, and you'll find that he has a reputation for being conciliatory in nature. And that is another way of saying that there's likely to be less trade tensions, not only between the United States and China, but less trade tensions between the United States and Europe, less trade tensions between the United States and Latin America. Now, some people would argue that's not a good thing because it means other countries can take advantage of us or something like that. I'm not going to take sides on that. I'll let other people make that decision. But less trade tensions mean that there's going to be more trade activity, more opportunity for us to grow our exports. And here in the United States, one of the groups that were hurt very hard because of these trade tensions were our US farmers, which we rely on. And I think it's one of the most important groups out there, because without food, we can't survive. And this year, Jennifer, 36% of all the income that these farmers earned came directly from the federal government in the form of farm support payments. And if you talk to any farmers, and I've done major presentations in front of farm groups. I recently spoke in front of a crowd of over 2,000 farmers, virtually again. And the feedback I get is they want to make money, but they want to make money from selling their products. They don't want to make money from receiving funds from the federal government. The good news, Jennifer, is that as you look to 2021, we're going to see these farmers making a lot more money, and it's not going to be coming from the federal government. It's going to be coming from selling the products. We know that China, for example, had the Asian swine flu fever that impacted their hogs, where more than half of their hogs had to be euthanized. And now they're rebuilding. And as they rebuild, guess what's going to happen? They're going to need more soybeans, because they're not only the largest soybean importer, but they also use 80% of all their soybeans in the form of feed. And so as they're building these inventory stocks and the economy is doing much, much better, we're going to see that farmers are going to do very, very well. But it's not just farmers. It's going to mean a lot of companies in the United States, manufacturers that export to many other countries with a sort of a reduction in trade tensions. It's going to be a lot easier for them to sell. The financial sector in the United States, China is very anxious to reduce these trade tensions, and it's going out of their way to make it easier for the financial sector to actually open up shop, and not just through joint ventures, but actually have majority control. We've seen that already with a lot of financial companies, JP Morgan certainly, and others going into China and having new opportunities. So I think that 2021 is going to introduce a lot of exciting opportunities as you see these trade tensions being reduced. And I say that in the most nonpartisan way. It's going to be positive as we export more, whether in the form of services or products. It's going to be a boost to GDP for the US, not only in 2021, but over the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, that's certainly good to hear. Thank you so much for that. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. And so I'll start with one of them. And it's, you spoke a little bit about the CARES package earlier, about the financial giving of the US government to help soften the blow of the pandemic. And there's a question about, is this level of borrowing by the US government sustainable in the long run?
Well, the answer is, of course not. We can't have the federal government running budget deficits in the $3.5 to $4.5 trillion every single day, because you're going to see that debt to GDP ratio just rising, and at some point you can't do it. Now, the good news, Jennifer, is that our debt to GDP ratio is nowhere near. It's less than half of what they have in Japan, so we don't have to worry. But there is real pain. And the analogy I like to think about when you ask that question is, if the fire trucks come into your house or apartment because there's a fire, you don't tell the fire engines not to put a lot of water because you're worried about them damaging the rug. You want them to use as much water to save the house and save the apartment. And you can always get new rugs and, of course, save lives. So at this point, it is not the time to worry about the debt. But longer term, you have to worry about that. And even today, I did a live television interview this morning as the employment report came out, and we saw the unemployment rate come down to 6.7%. Everybody was excited about that. And some people would say, oh, we have so much debt, we shouldn't have the federal government spending anymore. And I say, no, there's still a need out there. And in fact, what we've seen out there is that the labor force has dropped dramatically. More than 4 million drop in the labor force. So the unemployment rate, which dropped to 6.7%, if you account for the fact of those 4.1 million people that are no longer in the labor force. And by the way, if you're not in the labor force, guess what? You don't have a job. You basically dropped out because your kids can't go to school, so you got to babysit them, or you have someone that's sick at home, or you're afraid of the virus. So what I did was to compute the unemployment rate. What is the unemployment rate if you adjust for those people that are not working? and they're not in the labor force. And the actual national unemployment rate is 9%. So that is pretty serious. And remember, Jennifer, as I said earlier, we lost over 22 million jobs in this terrible pandemic at one point at the trough. That compares to just a little over 8 million during the global financial crisis. So you can see it's almost 3 times. So in that kind of an environment, we need the federal government to actually step in. The good news is, and I'm excited to do this presentation for the elder school out there, is that education is still the answer. Even with an unemployment rate of 6.7%, students out there that graduate with a bachelor's degree or higher, that unemployment rate today was 4.2%. So go back and tell everybody, even in this pandemic, go to school, send your kids to college, because you can still do better with a college education. And the numbers just this morning certainly bear that out.
Yep, certainly, thank you. I have a question about housing market, and there's been a lot of talk about evictions and then potential foreclosures of kind of small landlord owners. And will the kind of looming eviction crisis or foreclosures have any impact on the housing market and the economy into 2021?
Jennifer, there is no question. I was looking at some statistics on Saturday night, because what else can you do but to look at housing statistics on a Saturday night? And I found that by the end of the year, we're going to have close to 6.8 million people that could be evicted. Now, that's the bad news, Jennifer. The good news is that if we somehow get another package out there, either economic stimulus payments, extension of unemployment, PPP loans and things like that, so that you can rehire a lot of the people that you no longer have employed right now, that problem could go away, and also extending that moratorium on these rents. But if we do nothing, Jennifer, and this really pains me and it causes me a lot of distress, we can have almost 7 million people being thrown out of their apartments or their rentals, and that will put downward pressure on the value of this real estate. And not only that, but cause real economic hardship to these landlords. So that is why when people tell me the economy is doing well, I say, look at the statistics. Almost 7 million people that are at risk of being evicted. We need to do something, because the individuals in this predicament had nothing to do with this. This is a pandemic that was an exogenous event. They had nothing to do with causing it. So this is why we can't worry about debt, as you alluded to in one of your earlier questions, and we can't worry about how much we spend. We need to do something until this vaccine is out and people can get back to work, because we do not want this economy to completely collapse. There are too many people at risk and too many people that are economically vulnerable at this stage. And I'm glad you asked that question, very important.
I have one final question here as we kind of wrap up, and that is another question from the audience. And it was, from an investment standpoint, does it make sense to shift from tech to value? How soon should that shift start happening? Well,
as I alluded to in my prepared remarks, I think that this is an opportunity to basically barbell your portfolio. As I said, inflation is going to pick up a little bit, and historically, inflation picking up is very good for the value stocks. So I'm excited about value stocks, but inflation is not going to escalate. This is not the 1980s where we're going to have double-digit inflation. We're just going to see a marginal increase in inflation. So the technology stocks are still exciting. They're going to be maybe not as exciting as they were in 2020, but they're still going to be exciting. So I think that you can actually tilt your portfolio to get a little bit more exposure into the value stocks, while you're reducing your portfolio's exposure to technology, but don't eliminate it, because the reality is that a lot of the changes that occurred in 2020 are going to be permanent. As someone once said, sometimes there are years that go by and not a lot of things happen. And then sometimes there are years where it feels like decades. And 2020 was a year where we had almost a decade worth of changes. In terms of the way we purchase products digitally, we saw that just galloped. We probably pushed forward over 5 to 7 years worth of economic activity. That's not going to go away in 2021. So I still like the technology sector. The only difference, Jennifer, is that I like the value sector a little bit more in 2021 than I liked it in 2020. And therefore, let's tilt the portfolio, but let's not completely revolutionize it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and taking time to provide us with this detailed analysis and insight. I'm going to ask you now to please turn your video off and mute yourself, and we'll welcome back Dr. George Hammond, the Director of the Economic and Business Research Center in the Eller College of Management. Welcome, George. It's been quite a year so far. Can you summarize for us what happened in Arizona and maybe start with the labor market?
Sure, Jennifer. Thanks. And it's great to see everyone here this morning. Well, Arizona went on pretty much the same roller coaster ride as did the rest of the country and the rest of the world, really. From February to April, we lost about 295,000 jobs. That's roughly a 10% decline in state employment over a very short period. And that's in the neighborhood of the peak to trough job loss that we experienced during the Great Recession. The difference, of course, is that what we just went through happened in 2 months, and the Great Recession job losses persisted for years. Now, once we got the stay-at-home orders were lifted and economic activity started back up, we got some nice job gains in May and June, and we actually recovered about 47–48% of the jobs lost from February to April in very rapid fashion. From June, we've continued to add jobs all the way through October. And during that period, we've added back an additional about 56,000 jobs. And that's at job growth at a pretty rapid pace for the state of Arizona. On average, that translates into almost 14,000 jobs per month. And if we can sustain that pace in 2021, we will actually be back to pre-pandemic employment levels by about the middle of the year. Now, that's a pretty tall order. Adding jobs at a monthly rate of 14,000 is more than double the average monthly job growth rate during the 4 years before the Great Recession. And before the Great Recession, kind of that 2015 to 2019 period, we would add on average about 6,000 jobs per month. So, it's not clear that we can sustain that pace, but if we do, we'll be back to pre-pandemic levels at a rapid pace. How are we doing relative to the national economy? Well, the U.S. actually got hit a bit harder during that February to April period. The U.S. Employment loss was 14.5%. So we didn't get hit quite as hard as the U.S. economy during those worst couple of months, and we bounced back a little bit better, partly as a result. So if we think about the job loss and the jobs gained back, we lost those 295,000 jobs from February to April. Arizona has replaced about 2/3 of those jobs, leaving us about 100,000 jobs still to go to get back to that pre-pandemic level. For the nation, they've only replaced, at least through October, about 55% of the jobs lost during February to April. So Arizona overall is doing a bit better than the US. So in terms of job growth, we get hit hard, but we're on our way back. Now, the unemployment rate's been, well, frankly, a little weird lately. We saw the big spike in Arizona's unemployment rate in April, as we saw for the nation, but Arizona's rate didn't go up quite as much as the national rate did. In April, we peaked at just over 13%. Nationally, it was almost a 15% unemployment rate. And from April, we've seen the unemployment rate come back down pretty rapidly, both in Arizona and for the US. But Arizona's rate has been really volatile. It's kind of zigzagged around, with big drops and then a couple of months of pretty significant increases and then some more drops. So, the state rate has looked really weird, and there's a lot of speculation about what might be driving that. Probably the best advice is don't put too much weight or spend too much time trying to explain these monthly zigzags in the unemployment rate. They'll likely be revised away once we get the benchmark, the revised data in March of next year. Overall, Arizona's unemployment rate is significantly lower. In October, it was 8%. So it is below where it was in April. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of a little bit above or a little bit below the national average as we've gone through the recovery so far. But overall, I think the way I think about the labor market is we get hit hard in those early months. We are recovering gradually, and we're doing better than the U.S. overall, certainly in terms of jobs. And depending on the month you pick from that preliminary data, it'll be true for the unemployment rate as well.
Can you talk a little bit about which industries have been hit the hardest and what their recoveries look like so far?
Sure. So in terms of the industry that gets hit hardest, Jennifer, it's the one we thought was really going to suffer, and that's the travel and tourism sector. So in terms of leisure and hospitality jobs in Arizona, there, as of October, about 55,000 jobs below where they were in February. We have seen the leisure and hospitality sector gradually recover from the bottom that it reached in April, but still a long way to go. The eating and drinking places, employment at eating and drinking places has done a bit better, although it's still below that February peak. Accommodations and jobs in arts, entertainment, recreation are still really just miles away from where they were prior to the pandemic. And we've also seen significant job losses in professional and business services. This is a broad sector. It includes lots of different kinds of activities, but really the job losses have been concentrated in temporary help agencies, employment agencies. Those are those jobs that typically go first when the economy falls into a downturn. Kind of the surprise sector to get hit hard this year was education and health services. And most of those job losses have actually been in healthcare and social assistance. And of course, there's a lot of face-to-face close interaction in those sectors. And, we've just seen people continue to be reluctant to do those kind of normal checkups, either overall health checkups, diagnostic work. Same thing for dentists. It looks like demand is significantly reduced there, as well as people are still just nervous as the pandemic continues to really spread at a rapid pace. So overall, nearly all industries in the state have been affected in one way or another. But the surprise is that trade, transportation, and utilities jobs are actually well above where they were in February. Wholesale and retail trade jobs are back to where they were before the pandemic. But where the real growth has been in transportation and warehousing jobs. And this goes back to the story that Anthony mentioned. It's that big shift to online and delivery services has really boosted those transportation and warehousing jobs. But even so, retail is back to where it was prior to the pandemic.
So have the impacts of the pandemic been spread evenly across the state?
Yeah, that's something that you and I have been tracking here in the center, and no, it hasn't been evenly spread at all. The Flagstaff metropolitan area just has really continued to suffer. Jobs as of October in the Flagstaff metro area are still almost 18% below where they were prior to the pandemic, and it's really driven by the importance of the leisure and hospitality sector up there in that part of the state. Yeah, big contrast there is what we're seeing in the Sierra Vista Douglas metro area here in the southern part of the state, and then in Prescott. Those two metro areas have been right back in the neighborhood of where they were in February as of October. For the two big metro areas, Phoenix and Tucson, they're still well below where their employment levels were in February. The Phoenix metro area is about 3.3% below where it was in February. Tucson's about 4% below where it was in February. So pretty similar to the state average of 3.4%. So those two big real drivers of overall state job growth, still well below where they were in February. But even so, they're doing better than the U.S. As of October, the U.S. was still 6.6% below the employment level of February of last year. So it has been a really uneven experience across the state.
Well, you mentioned that the data ends here in October. Do you have any insight on, in particular, the travel and tourism industry and how they fared in November?
Sure. Well, one of the first things that that we did in the center, and Jennifer, you and everybody in the Economic and Business Research Center was part of this effort to really quickly respond to the pandemic and try to help the Arizona community understand what was happening to travel and tourism, and as it really rapidly deteriorated and then for a while rapidly improved. And the response was to stand up a set of weekly indicators that would reflect what was going on with the travel and tourism sector in Arizona where we could, and nationwide where if that was the only data that was available. So, we do have these weekly indicators. They're available on the MAP dashboard and also on our Arizona's Economy Online magazine. And they reflect U.S. hotel occupancy rates. And, what we see in those hotel occupancy rates nationally in November is, still about 30% or so below normal, below where they were last year at this time. Something similar in the TSA traveler throughput. So individuals passing through those TSA checkpoints, that's nationally, that's still running, at about a third of normal for this time of year. Of course, we track the monthly airport traffic here in Arizona at Phoenix Sky Harbor and at Tucson International, and there, that passenger traffic as of this, September, October was still about 60% below pre-pandemic levels. As far as the weekly data, we're still tracking the seated diners at restaurants using the Open Table app. So this is kind of a narrow segment of the restaurant industry, right? It doesn't include fast food or fast casual or takeout, but it's those places where you'd be looking to go walk in and sit down for a couple of hours and have a nice meal and a nice conversation. And that's really been hit hard during the pandemic. Things have improved from the initial shock, but in Arizona, the seated diner traffic in Arizona and Phoenix is 30 to 40% below where it was last year. And finally, we were tracking the data nationally at US box office sales at movie theaters. And, that's just running at these very low levels, $12 to $13 million per week in terms of US box office sales, which is, 90% or more below normal. So no real recovery in November, and based on the way the pandemic is going, probably not going to see much improvement as we go through December either. But our attendees and followers should continue to track that on our digital resources.
Thank you, George. We know that the labor market is showing signs of improvement since April, but it still has a long way to go. How did the CARES Act impact Arizona's recovery?
Yeah, as Anthony mentioned, Jennifer, the CARES Act had a big impact on the U.S. and a big impact on Arizona. We have the data for the second quarter of this year, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis suggests that pumped $40 billion into the state economy. And that alone drove almost a 12% over the year increase in our personal income. And that's just a giant increase in our personal income over the year. And the CARES Act includes a lot of different components, but in terms of the stimulus or the financial support, by far the biggest program was the economic impact payments, or so-called recovery rebates. Those are those $1,200 checks that were mailed out to individuals, more for families. That in Arizona was just over $23 billion. So, more than half of the $40 billion from the CARES Act overall. Next largest was the support for unemployed individuals. So, the various extensions and additions to unemployment insurance benefits. This includes the pandemic unemployment insurance, which extended UI coverage to self-employed and gig workers and others affected by the pandemic who would be and still are excluded from the regular state program. So the federal extension of UI benefits added about $9 billion. And finally, the Paycheck Protection Program, this was support for businesses, added about $5 billion here in Arizona in the second quarter. So the CARES Act was a significant contribution to our recovery. I think it was reflected in our retail sales and our job growth. There's a big concern here because most of the provisions of the CARES Act, maybe all of them, expire at the end of the year. Certainly all of the UI programs that are driven by the CARES Act will end at the end of this year. And that suggests that we're headed for a bit of a fiscal cliff if no further action is taken.
You mentioned earlier that the travel and tourism industry is still suffering and that the retail sector is kind of held its own a little bit. What has been going on with consumer spending?
Yeah, so consumer spending, Jennifer, has been a really interesting thing to track. And of course, we track the monthly retail sales data on Arizona's economy website. And kind of what we've seen is similar to what we've seen nationally, is that spending on goods, those tangible goods, is actually up compared to where we were in January earlier this year before the pandemic. So purchases of things like automobiles, appliances, building materials, especially for home building materials. All of that is way up. The one category that's down here in the state and elsewhere is purchases of apparel, because after all, we're all spending about half as much on apparel, because I'm certainly not investing in very much in the way of clothing below the waist. Although I do still ordinarily wear shorts or tennis shoes when I'm in a Zoom meeting. But overall, it's that spending on goods that is really kind of surged. And I think part of what's going on is, people just don't feel comfortable going into hotels, they're not going to hotels, motels, restaurants, bars. They're not doing, or can't do the things they would like to do in terms of arts, entertainment, and recreation. And that just leaves, particularly for people with jobs, they have more money that they can devote to putting a little bit more stuff in the house.
Right. So speaking of the house, let's talk a little bit about construction jobs and that sector overall. So we know that construction jobs have been a bit weak during the pandemic. How has the construction real estate sector been doing overall, though?
Right, the construction jobs have been a bit soft so far during the pandemic, but the big contrast there is what's going on with housing permits. I mean, housing permits in Arizona have exploded during 2020. The data through October, total housing permits in Arizona are a little bit over 25% above where they were at this time last year. So huge surge in permit activity. It's both single family activity and multifamily activity, big increases. And that suggests that we'll see that construction employment rapidly recover as we go into next year. And of course, we're seeing big house price increases across Arizona. That's partly related to really tight inventories across the state. And it may also be connected to increased migration into Arizona as people look for a little bit of a lower cost of living and a little bit more space to spread out. I know certainly, in many households, with two people who are working at home, things get a little tight.
Definitely. I've enjoyed our separate offices when my husband and I have both been at home. There's been a lot of talk about the increase in remote work. We have a forthcoming article on the MAP dashboard that looks at census data that suggests that working from home in Arizona went from 6.1% in 2018 to 36% during the pandemic. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have moving forward?
Yeah, it's really cool that we have that that data on remote work for Arizona, thanks to the Census Bureau. And I know you've got a map dashboard article coming out that will lay out all those details. I'm really looking forward to seeing that available to the wider public. But yeah, remote work has really raised some interesting issues across a large number of dimensions. And in in Arizona, the big part of the conversation is, will that ability of more workers to work remotely increase migration into Arizona? And there's some reasons to think that it might. A lot of remote workers are relatively highly educated. And if we think about those workers who can work from home, who are living in LA and San Francisco and Seattle and more in Denver, they're facing really high housing costs and overall a relatively high cost of living. And one of the things that we know about Arizona is that it has a relatively, at least compared to those areas, a low cost of living. Our overall cost of living is below the national average, and that's primarily driven by the relatively affordable housing here in the state. So it stands to reason that those mobile workers may look for a little bit bigger house in a cheaper market, and certainly Arizona would come up there. Part of the thinking there, you want to consider employer responses to this, and certainly Facebook has come out fairly publicly saying that if their remote workers choose to relocate to a lower cost of living environment, that lower cost of living might also be reflected in lower wages. And to the extent that happens, that will attenuate, at least to some degree, the attractiveness of Arizona. So there's the migration picture. I think that we're likely seeing some increased migration to Arizona, people seeking a more spread out environment with a bigger house and a relatively more affordable house. I think we're seeing some of that. But in the longer run, we don't need a pandemic to attract people to Arizona. People have traditionally moved to Arizona for its really attractive climate, fast economic growth. And I think, that will continue over the longer run. We'll continue to see net migration really be a major driver of our population growth. Jennifer, kind of the other aspect of this that's getting a lot of discussion is the impact on real estate, particularly commercial real estate, of remote work. And here there's an interesting survey that came out of Stanford, actually, that surveyed workers and asked them about their preferences. And what they found was, around 20 to 25% of workers wanted to work from home full time. About 20 to 25% wanted to work in the office full time. And the balance, about 50, 60%, just want more flexibility to work a couple days at home, a couple days in the office. The other side of that coin is employers. What will CEOs and heads of companies want to see their employees do? And there, the evidence seems a little bit more mixed. At least it's easy to come up with examples where CEOs are saying we really want our employees to come back to work. So the impacts on commercial real estate are a little bit harder to see at this point. We may see actually increased demand in the short run as people have to spread out a little bit more in order just to make employees who do come to the office feel more comfortable being there. And in the longer run, we'll have to wait and see. One thing I think we will see, and this is something Anthony mentioned that I think is right on, is that the shift to online has really moved forward several years, and that may shift a little bit the mix of commercial real estate taken up by retail and shifting that activity towards the warehouse sector.
Great. So I was wondering now if you could talk a little bit about the overall outlook for Arizona's economy.
Sure, I would be happy to do that. You want to give a quick overview, though, first of this small business research I know you've been doing?
Oh, sure. We've done some small business research recently on the MAP dashboard. We've posted 2 articles that looked at the impact of coronavirus on small businesses. And those articles suggested that at the end of October, small businesses had reported an improvement in the overall sentiment about the future of their business. However, we've seen that over 30% of small businesses have reported a loss in revenue since the beginning of the pandemic, and more than 70% have applied for federal or local assistance. You can find all of this information on the MAP dashboard homepage. There's 2 articles there posted on the homepage in the slideshow on small businesses. And one of them includes a detailed breakdown of which industries contain the largest percentage of small businesses. So if you're interested in that detailed industry data, it's there as well. And you can find that on the map. The map URL is mapaz-dashboard.arizona.edu. George, I think you'll have it up in a slide at the end here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. And I think that, sorry, I forgot to mention the small business stuff earlier, but I think that's an interesting dynamic here for the impacts of the pandemic and the recovery will be how those small businesses do. So I'm really excited about the research that you're doing, and we'll continue to publish on the progress of small businesses around the state.
Good, thank you. Well, do you mind talking now about the outlook for the state economy?
Sure. So the outlook, the outlook is unusually uncertain, as it has been since the beginning of the pandemic. We've been emphasizing that, and what's driving that is the uncertainty about the progress of the outbreak. I mean, we've learned a lot about the virus since March, but there's still uncertainty about just how bad things are going to get. We keep thinking it's gotten as bad as it's going to get, and then it gets a little bit worse. And I know you and others on the staff have asked me to stop saying that things have gotten as bad as they can, because something else always happens. Forests catch fire, and pretty soon we're in a situation that seems even worse than what we thought. But that's a big source of uncertainty that we're going to have to continue to track and have to continue to account for in forecasts. So the assumptions in the baseline forecast that you'll find summarized on azeconomy.org assume that the current surge doesn't get much worse than what we saw in July, and that vaccine is widely available nationally by about the middle of 2021. So it sounds like Anthony's thinking is along those lines as well. The baseline forecast does assume that we get a significant additional federal stimulus in the fourth quarter. That means this month. If we don't get that, then the baseline may wind up being a bit too optimistic. But essentially the baseline forecast calls for Arizona to get back to pre-pandemic employment levels by about the middle of 2021. And that means that solid population growth, solid income growth, and overall solid retail sales growth as we go through the recovery to pre-pandemic levels.
What are some of the risks to that outlook?
So the risks, that revolves around the things we've been talking about, Jennifer. That's if the outbreak gets a lot worse than we expected, if there are delays in the vaccine delivery and wide distribution of the vaccine, and then if we don't get a federal fiscal stimulus of pretty significant magnitude, then I think we're looking at a slower recovery. I think we're looking at something towards the end of 2021 or early 2022.
Okay. Well, I think we have a little bit of time here for questions from the audience. So the first question here I'll ask is, how is in-migration from California and other places affecting our housing market? Will our local workforce be priced out of the market?
Right. So good question. The Arizona has very tight migration and actually employment ties with California. If we look at, who moves to Arizona from other states, California is by far the largest state of origin for people who are moving to Arizona. So it's a tight connection, and we see that connection actually in terms of remote work. Individuals who live in Arizona but work in other states. California is the connection, and as we switch that around, The tight connection is with California as well. So we have really tight connections there. And, I would suspect that we are seeing some additional migration from California into Arizona. It's probably people looking for that lower cost of living, the more affordable housing. That does have the potential to drive up house prices and reduce our overall housing affordability. Hopefully the recent surge in housing permits will help ameliorate that, generate some additional supply that'll help keep house prices from accelerating too far above what we see in terms of income growth. But that's that overall issue of housing affordability, housing cost burden is something that you've done some really cool research on the MAP dashboard, Jennifer. So I'd encourage people to check that out and see where Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson stack up in terms of housing affordability and housing cost burden.
Great. Thank you. We have another question asking, how much of the population labor force do you think are being left out of our unemployment numbers? And how do we address the suffering of this segment of the population?
Well, that's a really good question. I used to know the answer. It's so how many are being left out? The best way to get a handle on that, I think, is to look at the broader measures of unemployment. And this is something that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does put together. It is in the supporting materials that are on aseaeconomy.org. We would look at the number that we all quote is the official unemployment rate, and this excludes people who are marginally attached to the labor force. They're discouraged, they're working part-time for economic reasons, and those are people who are picked up in this broader unemployment rate, the U6 rate. The U6 rate has improved since April, but it's well above. My recollection is that it's in the neighborhood of double that U3 rate for the nation. We do have a U6 estimate that comes out, or this broad measure that's available for Arizona, but it only comes out once a year. It'll be out early next year, and we'll feature that for people once we have that measure. But for unemployed individuals, really the way we offer that support is through the social safety net, including unemployment insurance benefits. I think the pandemic unemployment assistance, while it's been significantly attacked by scammers, that while where that is directing support to the self-employed, small businesses, and gig workers who are excluded from the regular state program, I think that's a great idea. That's something that we would really benefit from seeing extended into 2021.
Okay, so we have time for one last question here, and it's about retail trade. If retail in Arizona is back to where it was pre-pandemic, is that because of online shopping? And where does that leave brick and mortar businesses in Tucson and Arizona?
Right, so retail jobs are back to their prior peak, which sounds weird given the shift to online. And that is a really good question. I'm not sure that we know the answer. The jobs in the current establishment survey, current employment survey, are classified by the main type of business, or the main goal of the business. So it's entirely possible for a small-ish retailer to hire a web programmer full-time to help manage all that and hire delivery staff. And those people would show up as retail employees. They wouldn't show up elsewhere unless they were working for a delivery establishment, which was separate from the retail organization. So it's entirely possible, we don't know yet, but it's entirely possible that some of the growth in retail is actually brick and mortar retailers bringing on people to do their web programming and their management and distribution in that way. So it's a little hard to tell. We can't say for sure, but it's something that we'll keep an eye on going forward.
Okay, well, as we wrap up here today, can you give us some final thoughts on the state economy and the outlook?
Sure. Well, my final thoughts are that the Arizona economy was growing rapidly before the pandemic began. We took a big hit during the pandemic, although not quite as big a hit as the nation did. And we are in the process of recovering, and we're actually making progress in that direction. As we think about the longer term, the pandemic will end, and with some luck, it will end significant portion next year, and we'll start to think about the long run again in Arizona. And Arizona is well positioned to add jobs, population at a rapid pace as we get back to something that's more normal. But I'm with Anthony in terms of his recommendation that investing in education is key. The states and metro areas that have relatively high shares of residents with a bachelor's degree or better, particularly, are going to be the states and local areas that are going to do best in terms of increasing their overall standard of living. And that's particularly important as we think about the impacts of increased automation, which is another thing that has been spurred by the pandemic, as we think about the impacts of automation on overall employment. So with that, Jennifer, I think I'll launch into the shameless self-promotion part of the presentation. So if our attendees will forgive me, I'm gonna share my screen again and talk a little bit about the digital resources that we have available to help you understand how Arizona is doing in terms of its economic recovery. As always, be sure and download our Arizona's Economy smartphone app. This puts the latest data for Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, all Arizona counties and the nation at your fingertips and in your pocket. Best of all, it's available free at the App Store for your iPhone and iPad, and you can download it for Android devices at Google Play. Now, as always, the Forecasting Project is the core of what we do in these presentations. So thanks again to the sponsors of the Forecasting Project. Without them, we wouldn't be here. If you need detailed forecast information, please visit the Forecasting Project website, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what that entails. Now, Jennifer and I talked about the Making Action Possible dashboard. This is made possible by our sponsors and partners. Our partners are the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, the Pima Association of Governments, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corridor, and the University of Arizona. Our sustaining sponsors are Tucson Electric Power, the Thomas R. Brown Family Foundations, and the Freeport McMoran Foundation. So be sure and check that out for the latest data and analysis. If you need data on how Arizona's role in border trade is playing out during the pandemic, and there's some really cool information there on Arizona's exports and imports and flows through our border ports of entry of both people and goods that you can find there. That's available at our Arizona-Mexico Economic Indicators site. That's made possible by the Arizona-Mexico Commission, the Arizona Commerce Authority, and the Arizona Department of Transportation. Also, check out our Arizona's Economy online magazine for high-frequency data for quarterly updates of my latest forecasts and for supporting materials for my presentation today. You can get there at the URL azeconomy.org or azeconomy.eller.arizona.edu. And finally, a special thank you to JP Morgan Chase for sponsoring today's event. We really do appreciate it very much, and the partnership with JP Morgan Chase means so much to the center and to the college. So thank you again. So let me conclude by thanking the Eller College of Management's Marketing and Communications Department, especially Amy Schmitz, Sophia Sanchez, and Gavin Imes for their support in putting together today's event. I also want to thank my team in the Economic and Business Research Center, especially Miley Nadelhofer, Jennifer Pullen, and Val Rice. They're the ones who really make all this possible. And finally, on behalf of the University of Arizona, and I need to thank the staff of the Economic and Business Research Center, who really make all of this possible, especially Alicia Kim, Miley Nadelhofer, Vera Pavlakovich-Kochi, Jennifer Pullen, Valerie Rice, and Lori Sheldon. We will be posting a recording of this webinar as soon as we can. So check back at azeconomy.org for that. So finally, we all wish you safe and happy holidays, and we look forward to seeing you back at our Breakfast with the Economists in June. Take care, and we will see you soon.